September 1944. Arnhem, Holland. A British private crossed enemy lines 4 times in 3 days. First crossing, 2 hours. Second crossing, 4 hours. Third crossing, 7 hours, hiding in a cellar 6 feet from a German position, then 3 hours moving. Fourth crossing. Didn't finish. Each time he wore different clothes. Each time he took a different route. Each time the Germans were looking for someone exactly like him. On the 4th crossing, they found him. He was searched thoroughly. Every pocket, every seam, every layer of clothing. No message was found because the message wasn't there anymore. He had swallowed it before he reached the checkpoint. He'd read it, memorized it, and swallowed it. If he made it to the destination, he'd deliver everything from memory. If he didn't make it, at least the information wouldn't. Subscribe right now, because this story is about more than courage. It's about a man who, alone, on foot, behind enemy lines with everything going wrong around him, made the clearest possible decision in the worst possible moment, and then couldn't explain why it was a hard decision at all. To understand what Thomas Hooper was doing on those streets, you first need to understand what was happening in Arnhem in September 1944. And to understand that, you need to understand the mood in Allied headquarters in the summer of 1944. Normandy had worked. D-Day had worked. By August, Paris was liberated. German forces were retreating across France. The war that had seemed permanent, the war that had been grinding since 1939, was suddenly moving fast. The end felt real. For the first time, people were actually calculating when. That mood produced Operation Market Garden. The plan was Field Marshal Montgomery's, the largest airborne operation in history. American and British paratroopers would drop into Holland in a coordinated sequence, seizing a series of bridges along a 60-mile corridor. Ground forces would drive north along that corridor, crossing each bridge in succession. At the far end of the corridor at Arnhem was a bridge over the Rhine. Take that bridge, cross into Germany, and the war's final phase begins. The planners estimated it could end the war by Christmas 1944. On paper, it was audacious, imaginative, potentially decisive. In practice, almost everything that could go wrong did. The Allied intelligence picture was incomplete. 2 SS Panzer divisions, battle-hardened, recently reinforced, were resting and refitting in the Arnhem area. This information existed. It was in the intelligence reports. It was largely discounted because the planning had momentum, and no one wanted to hear reasons to slow down. The British 1st Airborne Division dropped near Arnhem on September 17, 1944. 10,000 men. And almost immediately, everything started to unravel. Thomas Allen Hooper, born in Birmingham, 1922. His father worked in a textile mill. His mother stayed home and raised 4 children in a terraced house in a working-class neighborhood where every family on the street had the same story. Not a lot of money, a lot of work. A quiet, steady toughness about ordinary life that didn't announce itself. Hooper left school and went into the mill with his father. The same machines, the same noise, the kind of work that takes your hands and gives your mind time to wander, or time to go quiet. He was 22 when he volunteered. 1st Airborne Division, 1st Parachute Brigade. Parachute training was physically demanding and psychologically specific. The ability to jump out of an aircraft at altitude repeatedly, without hesitation. That's not something everyone can do on demand. Some people train it in. Some people have it from somewhere else. Hooper's training assessments are unremarkable. Average physical scores, average weapons scores, average across the board, except one category. His instructors noted separately in different assessments the same quality. He performed better under pressure than under normal conditions. The more chaotic the situation, the more clearly he seemed to think. In exercises where other trainees froze or rushed, Hooper slowed down. There's a specific term for this in psychology: stress inoculation. Some people, through training or temperament, develop the ability to perform their best thinking exactly when the situation is most hostile to thinking. Hooper had it, and in Arnhem in September 1944, that quality was the difference between mission success and mission failure. 4 separate times. September 17, 1944. The first airborne drops near Arnhem, and almost immediately, the radios stopped working. This was not a minor operational inconvenience. This was catastrophic. The British 1st Airborne Division's communication equipment was operating on frequencies that proved incompatible with the local terrain and atmospheric conditions. The sets were pre-war designs, underpowered for the distances involved and prone to interference. German electronic warfare systems were jamming broad frequency bands. For whatever combination of reasons, the radios didn't work. The division couldn't reach its own higher headquarters. Headquarters couldn't reach the units at Arnhem. The RAF couldn't receive accurate target coordinates for supply drops. The ground forces driving north couldn't get real-time updates on the situation at the bridge. In modern military terms, this was a complete loss of situational awareness at every level of command. And in practical terms, it meant this. The paratroopers holding the north end of Arnhem Bridge, eventually about 700 men under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, were fighting completely cut off, surrounded, running out of ammunition, unable to communicate their position, their needs, or their situation to anyone outside the shrinking perimeter. Supply drops were going to the wrong locations. Reinforcements couldn't find them. The ground forces knew something was wrong, but couldn't get the information they needed to respond. The only way to get a message out, or in, was to send a man, on foot, through German lines, in civilian clothes. Hooper volunteered. September 18, 1944. Arnhem, early morning. Hooper was given a set of civilian clothes sourced by the Dutch resistance. A farmer's jacket, worn trousers, heavy boots. The kind of clothes a working-class Dutch laborer would wear. He had no weapon. Carrying a weapon meant a death sentence if caught. No prisoner of war protection, just immediate execution under the standing German orders for combatants in civilian clothing. Beneath the civilian clothes, he kept his military identification. This was a calculated risk. If found, it might protect him under the laws of war. If not found, he could maintain a civilian cover longer. The message was small, a tightly folded piece of paper. Position coordinates, casualty figures, urgent requests, everything the command needed to make sense of what was happening at Arnhem Bridge. He moved out before dawn. The Dutch resistance had provided him with initial route information, which streets, which gardens, which gaps in the German positions. Beyond the first few hundred meters, he was on his own assessment. The first crossing took 2 hours. 3 German checkpoints, 2 moving patrols, a sentry position he had to spend 30 minutes waiting to move past. He reached the destination, delivered the message, came back, and the next day, he was sent again. The second crossing was harder. The German grip on Arnhem streets was tightening. Civilian movement was being restricted. Every significant intersection had a checkpoint. Every checkpoint involved questions. Hooper had no Flemish, but he'd studied a handful of words, enough for a basic interaction. More importantly, he understood something that language lessons don't teach: what a person looks like when they're just trying to get from one place to another and are tired and slightly afraid and don't want any trouble. He looked like that person. At one checkpoint, a German corporal looked at his hands. Laborer's hands, calloused and stained from years of mill work. Exactly the hands of the civilian he was pretending to be. The corporal waved him through. Second crossing. 4 hours. Message delivered. Back. The third crossing nearly didn't happen. Hooper was moving through a residential street when a German unit set up a temporary position ahead of him. 4 soldiers with a machine gun emplacement. No way forward, no way back without being seen. He found a cellar door in the side of a house, not locked. He went in and waited. 7 hours. The soldiers were 6 meters above him. He could hear their conversations, their boots on the floor, the sound of equipment being moved. For 7 hours, he controlled his breathing, his movement, the sounds he made. When they finally left, He gave it another 20 minutes, then moved. Third crossing, 10 hours total. Message delivered. Back. Day 4, he was called in again. Before he left for the 4th crossing, Hooper made an assessment. 3 crossings had been completed. German security was tightening with each day. The Arnhem perimeter was shrinking. German attention to the streets and checkpoints around the battle zone was at maximum. His cover had held 3 times. The same cover, the same general appearance, the same area. The probability that it would hold a 4th time was lower than it had been on any of the previous 3. He knew this. He went anyway. But before he left the perimeter, before he was in German-controlled territory, he did something none of the documentation indicates he was instructed to do. He read the message carefully, multiple times, memorized every detail, the position coordinates, the casualty numbers, the ammunition state, the specific requests, and then he swallowed it. If he reached the destination, he would deliver everything verbally, from memory, every number, every position, every request. If he was caught, there would be nothing on him. He reached the 1st checkpoint without incident. The 2nd checkpoint, a German NCO stopped him, asked questions. Hooper gave his usual routine. It worked. The 3rd checkpoint, he was stopped by an officer, not an NCO, an officer who was more methodical, more thorough, more suspicious in a way that went beyond procedure. He was searched, completely. Nothing was found. But the officer wasn't satisfied. He held Hooper, sent for backup, held him again. 6 hours later, Hooper was classified as a prisoner of war and transferred to a holding facility. He never reached the destination. The message never arrived. Let me stop here for a second, because the decision to swallow the message looks simple from the outside. It's not. Think about what it actually meant. Swallowing the message meant the written record was gone. If Hooper made it to the destination, he'd have to deliver everything from memory, exact coordinates, exact numbers, exact requests. Human memory under stress is not perfectly reliable. This was a deliberate trade-off, trading the certainty of written information for the security of having nothing on him. But there's a second thing that decision said, and it's more important. It said, if I'm caught and I can't get out of this, at least the information doesn't fall into German hands. Whatever happens to me, the message is gone. Hooper chose the security of the information over the reliability of delivery. Under those conditions, in that moment, that was the right call, but it was still a call. It required someone to weigh those 2 things against each other, alone, quickly, on a street in Arnhem in September 1944. I want to ask you something. If you were carrying that message, would you have swallowed it? Or would you have kept it hidden and hoped the search wasn't thorough enough? Drop it in the comments. I want to know how you'd think through that. And if this kind of story is worth your time, subscribe right now. Every day on this channel, stories like this that stayed buried in unit records and after-action reports. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one, and tell me where you're watching from. Now let's go to the other side of that interrogation table. The German intelligence officer who questioned Hooper for 6 hours filed a report afterward. That report was recovered after the war. Most of it is standard interrogation documentation. Questions asked, answers given, operational conclusions. But at the end of the report, in a section for the officer's personal assessment, there is a handwritten addition that doesn't match the clinical language of the rest of the document. It reads, "This kind of calm is not acquired through training." 6 words, added by hand, from an officer who had spent 6 hours trying to break this man and couldn't do it. The officer knew Hooper was a courier. He was certain of it. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The location, the direction of movement, the timing, the absence of any credible civilian reason to be in that area. But there was no evidence. Nothing on him. No paper. No message. Nothing. And for 6 hours, there was no crack in the composure, no moment of hesitation, no slip. Just a man who looked at his questioner with steady eyes and said nothing. The officer who wrote, "This kind of calm is not acquired through training," was a professional. He'd questioned many people. He recognized something in Hooper that he couldn't categorize, couldn't account for, couldn't explain. He was right that it wasn't training. It was something Hooper had brought with him from a textile mill in Birmingham, something that had nothing to do with parachutes or Arnhem or the war. He'd always been able to go quiet when everything else was loud. While Hooper was in German custody, the battle he'd been carrying messages for was reaching its end. September 25, 1944. The British paratroopers at Arnhem Bridge had been holding for 9 days. What began as roughly 10,000 men had been reduced, through casualties, capture, and attrition, to approximately 2,000 who were still capable of moving. The order came to withdraw. Under the cover of darkness, in rain and silence, they crossed the Rhine. Some by boat, some by swimming, some by improvised means, moving quietly so the Germans wouldn't hear. Of the roughly 10,000 men who dropped into the Arnhem area 9 days earlier, approximately 1,400 were killed. Over 6,000 were captured. Around 2,000 got back across the river. Operation Market Garden was officially classified as a failure. The bridge that was supposed to open the road into Germany, the bridge they'd planned to take and hold, the bridge that was supposed to end the war, was still in German hands. Hooper learned about the Arnhem withdrawal from another prisoner in the holding facility. We don't know what he said, we don't know what he felt. He never talked about it publicly. But he'd made 4 attempts to keep that operation alive. 4 trips through German lines carrying information that might have made a difference. And it had failed anyway. Hooper spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. He was transferred through several facilities, eventually ending up in a standard German prisoner of war camp in central Germany. Conditions were difficult, food was short, winters were cold. The specific psychological weight of captivity that has no defined end date is its own particular hardship. He made 2 escape attempts. The first got him outside the wire and about 2 miles down the road before a patrol picked him up. 2 weeks in solitary. The second was more elaborately planned. He'd been studying the camp layout for months, identified a gap in the night patrol rotation, prepared a route. He got further than the first time, caught at a road checkpoint. 2 more weeks in solitary. He started working on a third plan. In April 1945, Allied forces reached the camp. The gates opened. Hooper walked out. "There's something I want to come back to before we continue." After the war, Hooper was asked once about the decision to swallow the message. A brief interview, not widely reported. The journalist asked one question: "Why did you swallow it?" Hooper thought about it. Then he shrugged. "What else was I going to do?" he said. That answer has stayed with me. Because what else was I going to do is not modesty. It's not deflection. It's Hooper genuinely not understanding what the alternative would have been. He wasn't framing a calculated decision as an obvious one for the reporter's benefit. He actually found the decision obvious. And that, I think, is the most important thing this story reveals. The most effective kind of courage isn't the kind that feels dramatic. It's the kind that feels like common sense, where the right thing to do is so clear that you don't experience it as courage at all. You just do it, and then you're confused when people find it remarkable. Hooper had that kind of courage 4 times, and when asked about it, he couldn't explain why it was worth asking about. What else was I going to do? Drop your thoughts on that in the comments, because I genuinely believe that question, and the answer it implies, says something important about what makes people capable in extreme situations. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Hit the bell. These stories deserve to be heard. There's a part of this story that doesn't get enough attention. Hooper didn't make those 4 crossings alone. Every set of civilian clothes came from somewhere. The Dutch resistance sourced them. Men and women who were themselves living under German occupation, who had their own risks to manage, their own families to protect. Providing clothing to a British operative was a serious offense under German occupation law. Discovery meant arrest. Often it meant something worse. The cellar where Hooper spent 7 hours on the 3rd crossing That was a Dutch house. Someone's home. The family who owned it may not have known he was there, or they may have known and left the door unlocked deliberately. Either way, a Dutch family's home became the hiding place that saved the third mission. The route information for the first crossing. Dutch resistance members provided that. People who had been living in German-occupied Holland for 4 years, who had built up a detailed understanding of patrol patterns and checkpoint locations, who passed that knowledge to a British paratrooper they'd never met before and would likely never see again. Why did they take those risks? Because for them, the British soldiers at Arnhem weren't an abstract military operation. They were the possibility of liberation. Every day the bridge held, every message that got through, every hour that the operation stayed alive. That was another day, closer to something they hadn't had since 1940. It's worth remembering, when we talk about Hooper, that he was walking on roads that Dutch people had kept clear for him. What was in those messages that Hooper was carrying? The exact contents of the first 3 messages haven't been fully declassified, but based on the operational situation and the standard format for unit situation reports, historians have a reasonable picture. Position coordinates, exactly where the units were holding, which areas were contested, which had been lost. This information was critical for the RAF supply drops that were consistently going to the wrong locations because the command had no accurate picture of the perimeter. Casualty figures, how many men were still combat effective, how many wounded, what the attrition rate looked like. This determined whether reinforcement was still viable or whether the operation was already past saving. Ammunition state, how many rounds per man, how many hours of sustained combat remained before the position became untenable. This was probably the single most urgent piece of information after the first few days. Specific requests, identification of the supply drop coordinates that would actually reach the paratroopers, requests for specific calibers of ammunition, medical supplies, reinforcement priorities. Each message was a compressed operational picture of a unit that was fighting blind, that couldn't communicate directly, that needed the outside world to understand what it was dealing with. Whether those messages changed anything, whether any of the information Hooper delivered affected decisions that affected outcomes, we can't say with certainty. What we can say is that without him, the command would have had nothing. He was the only channel. Arnhem has a complicated legacy in military history. Operation Market Garden is studied in military academies around the world, not as a model of success, but as a case study in what happens when operational optimism overrides intelligence assessment, when planning momentum drowns out legitimate concerns, when the gap between what a plan assumes and what the ground reality is becomes too large to bridge. The intelligence failures are well documented. The communication failures are well documented. The decision to proceed despite known problems is well documented. What's less documented are the individual stories from inside the 9 days. The paratroopers who held the north end of Arnhem Bridge for 4 days against overwhelming German armored force. That's a documented story, somewhat famous. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's name is on the bridge today, but below that level, the platoon actions, the individual decisions, the men doing specific things that kept the operation alive 1 more hour. Those stories are mostly in unit records that few people read. Hooper's 4 crossings are in that category. His contribution wasn't decisive in the way that holding the bridge was decisive, but in a situation where the command was operating blind, where every piece of accurate information about the Arnhem perimeter was worth more than its weight in any material. The man who was the only working communication channel mattered. April 1945. The camp was liberated. May 1945. The war in Europe ended. Hooper came back to Birmingham, back to his family, back to the same neighborhood, the same streets, the same people. He received the military medal. The citation covered the 4 crossings and his conduct during interrogation. The ceremony was brief and formal. He received the medal and said thank you. The following week, he went back to the mill. His father was still working there. He took a position on the same floor. Different machines, the same noise, the same rhythm, the same going quiet that a mill requires. He married in 1947. 2 children, a house 2 streets from where he grew up. He never spoke publicly about Arnhem. Privately, to his family, he spoke about it in the same terms he used when he was asked directly. His children asked once when they were old enough to understand what the war had meant. "Dad, what did you do?" He thought about it. "I walked," he said. "A lot of walking." That was the whole answer. In the 1990s, a researcher working through the operational records of the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem found a footnote, not a headline, not a chapter, a footnote. It referenced a private, name given as T.A. Hooper, who had conducted multiple liaison crossings through German-controlled areas during the Arnhem operation. 4 crossings attempted, 3 completed, 1 interrupted by capture. The researcher followed the thread. Unit records, medal citation, the German interrogation report. In 1998, she published a short paper in a British military history journal. 1 paragraph described Hooper's 4 crossings. Another described the decision to swallow the 4th message. A 3rd paragraph concluded, Hooper's crossings represent one of the least documented but most consequential individual contributions to the Arnhem operation. In the absence of functional communications, he was the only reliable information channel between the Arnhem perimeter and higher command for the first critical days of the battle. His decision to swallow the 4th message, made independently, without instruction, under immediate threat of capture, was operationally correct and personally courageous in a manner that the citation language barely captures. The language barely captures it, because the citation said what happened. It didn't say how it felt to spend 7 hours in a cellar 6 feet from a German position. It didn't say what it took to keep walking toward a checkpoint when you knew the 4th time was different. It didn't say what else was I gonna do actually means when you're the one who said it. The bridge at Arnhem is still there. It was damaged in the fighting and rebuilt after the war. In 1977, the Dutch government officially renamed it the John Frost Bridge, after the British lieutenant colonel who held the north end for 4 days with his diminishing battalion. Every September, the Dutch hold a commemoration at Arnhem, flowers at the bridge, a ceremony at the memorial. Old veterans, fewer each year, and their families. Dutch civilians who have been doing this for 80 years, who were children during the occupation, and are now in their 80s and 90s. There's a memorial near the bridge. On it, words that translate roughly as, "Those who fell here, fell for those who sought freedom." Hooper's name isn't on it. He didn't fall at Arnhem, he came home. He had 40 more years in Birmingham. But somewhere in the 9 days that memorial commemorates, in the information that reached the command, in the decisions that got made with that information, in the hours that the operation survived on messages carried by 1 man through German checkpoints, Hooper was there. Before we close, I want to ask you one more thing. We've talked about 4 crossings, a swallowed message, 6 hours of silence in an interrogation room. But the thing I keep coming back to is that answer. What else was I going to do? There's a specific kind of person who says that. Someone for whom the right action under pressure isn't a calculation. It's just what you do, not because they're fearless, not because they're built differently, but because somewhere along the way they develop the habit of asking one question: what actually needs to happen here? And then doing it. That habit doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It doesn't generate the kind of story that goes into a headline. It generates footnotes in military history journals, citations that barely capture it, but it's what actually wins things. The big decisions, the famous moments, those happen because of people like Hooper who made the small decisions correctly in the moments nobody was watching. That's what this channel is about. Every day. The footnotes, the people who barely got into the record. Subscribe, hit the bell, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments. Who's the person in your life who has that quality? The one who just does the right thing without drama? I'd love to know. Thomas Allen Hooper died in 1991. He was 69. Birmingham, his own home. He appears in one footnote in one paper in one military history journal, in his unit records, in his medal citation, in a German interrogation report that calls him calm in a way that training can't produce. That's the paper trail. The actual trail. 4 routes through German-held streets in a city that was being destroyed around him. 4 sets of civilian clothes. 7 hours in a cellar. A message read and memorized and swallowed. That exists in documents almost nobody reads, and in the memory of a man who described the whole thing as a lot of walking. Arnhem is remembered as a failure. A brave, costly, ultimately unsuccessful operation that didn't shorten the war the way it was supposed to. But inside that failure, there were 9 days. And inside those 9 days, there were men who kept doing their jobs after every reason to stop doing their jobs had been removed. The radios didn't work. The reinforcements didn't come. The ground forces were too far away. The ammunition was running out. And a private from Birmingham walked through German lines 4 times to keep the information moving. He swallowed the 4th message before the checkpoint. They searched him. They found nothing. They held him anyway. And the message, or what was left of it, dissolved and gone, never arrived. Arnhem fell, but it fell 4 messages later than it would have. What else was I going to do? Exactly that, exactly that. If this story got to you, hit the like button. Subscribe for more every day. I find the ones that ended up in footnotes instead of chapters. Ring the bell. Share it with someone who should hear it.